Today, Palestinians, as I say, awoke to bury their dead. More than 100 people have died since the start of the March of Return in April this year. To further deal with the escalating violence in Gaza and what is most likely to transpire from the UN Security Council meeting and other world bodies this week, we're joined in the studio by the director of the Afro-Middle East Center, Jeenah. Good evening to you. And I mean, firstly, just your response to not only the deaths from yesterday, but what is surely going to be a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. You heard there Doctors Without Borders saying medical supplies, dealing with the patients that have now come in because of the blockade is a particular challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's the blockade is something that's difficult to understand when we are living as far away as we are. But you're looking at a small strip of land, 36 kilometers by 10 kilometers, with a population of 2.5 million people, and completely blockaded. No control over the coastline, the airspace, or their borders. Completely regulated in terms of that. And so while the Israelis say that they withdrew from Gaza, it really is still under occupation, and no reconstruction material to go in to build people's houses that were destroyed, no medical supplies. And after a day like yesterday, the little medical supplies that they have, they would run out of, and the equipment that they have is definitely not sufficient to deal with the problem.
Let's maybe look at broader issues around what's unfolded in recent days. If we go back to the idea of a two-state solution, you've written extensively about this, and you say it's a misnomer. There is no two-state solution, at least not on the cards.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, despite the fact that some Israelis continue talking about a two-state solution, most don't bother anymore, and most of the Palestinian groups, whether Fatah, Hamas, etc., talk about a two-state solution. The reality is that that's not a possibility. What Israel has done is made it an impossibility. In the West Bank, for example, almost 50% of the West Bank is covered by the settlement infrastructure. That's settlements plus the highways that are for settlers or for Jews only, roads that are for Jews only, etc. And so you have an impossible situation here. And whenever Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about a two-state solution, which he occasionally does, most recently, for example, in an interview, he described what he understood by a two-state solution. It would be a situation where a Palestinian quote-unquote state would have no control over its borders, would have no control over its airspace, would have no control over the water under its land, the aquifers or the minerals under its land, would have no control over its coastline in Gaza, or the gas in the sea that's part of its coastline, and would not be allowed to have a defense force. Essentially, it would be a territory that would have less power and less protection than Bophuthatswana had in South Africa. Now, that's not a two-state solution. That is a state that holds another territory as a vassal. The only way that you can talk of achieving justice in this situation is a new arrangement where you have a single state which is democratic, which is secular, where all citizens enjoy equal rights, and all citizens are protected under the law.
So, I mean, essentially then we're moving away from that popular notion of a two-state solution as we saw in the 90s to something maybe more similar to what was achieved here in South Africa. Much is to be drawn from our experience. Will the objections of the South African government, for example, of what's transpired there in the last 24 hours or so, help in this situation, or would we never really be taken that seriously in a mediation role?
No, the Israelis have never taken South Africa seriously in a mediation role. I mean, there was a time under President Thabo Mbeki when South Africa foolishly thought that it could play that role, and was really played by the Israelis, because President Mbeki started this process, the spear process, brought in Israelis, and Israelis never sent government people, but former government officials. Palestinians came together, etc. And the only result, well, two results of that. One was that thereafter, whenever South Africa was critical of Israel's actions, like what's happening now, the Israelis and the pro-Israeli lobby in South Africa would say, this is not helpful in your role as a mediator, which is what we saw on TV a few minutes ago. That was the first result. So South Africa was held hostage. And the second result was that because President Thabo Mbeki wanted to make it seem as if South Africa was more even-handed, signed a trade agreement with Israel in 2003, 2004, as a result of which trade between South Africa and Israel has been increasing virtually every year.
We know, of course.
So Israel is not willing to accept South Africa as a mediator, especially now when you have Trump in the White House.
We know, of course, that part of what made the apartheid government unravel was its continued isolation internationally. What's the response of the UN to all of this? As you say, Netanyahu has been emboldened by the Trump administration. Is there any sense that we can get towards some kind of solution with so much support for Israel by Washington?
Not through the UN, not right now. I think that what we require is a sea change among nations. And so your question about South Africa, whether its effort by recalling the ambassador means anything, on its own, no. But if South Africa is able to convince other states, not just other African states, some African states are very much pro-Israeli, but particularly other states in the south and certain European states. You might have noticed that yesterday's inauguration of the embassy, there were more African diplomats there than Europeans. The Europeans virtually boycotted it. But if South Africa were to lead the way in charting out a new course for the world around the Palestinian-Israeli issue, I think that can be done if there's a big body of opinion around that. Of course, it doesn't help much when South Africa's statement again talks about this tired, non-existent two-state solution.
All right, we'll leave it there. That was the director of the Afro-Middle East Center, Naim Jeenah.